A Sydney-born man was recently stunned to discover he lost his Australian citizenship when he applied for an Irish passport over 20 years ago. It's due to a little-known law that was actually repealed in 2002, but it could still affect thousands of other people. I'm joined now by Professor Kim Rubenstein, an expert in citizenship law at the University of Canberra. Very good evening to you. Explain to us, what was this little-known law?
Well, from 1948, when Australian citizenship first became a status, because before that time, all people in Australia were British subjects, until 2002, there were sort of two systems in place for dual citizenship in Australia. If you were a migrant and you came to Australia, Australia did not require you to give up your citizenship. So you could stay a citizen of that country, depending on their laws, and become an Australian citizen. But if you were an Australian citizen and then you took up a new citizenship, then you lost your Australian citizenship. That was Section 17. And by 2002, there was public sentiment and agreement that that was not appropriate in a globalized world. And so from 2002 onwards, everyone is entitled to dual citizenship. But for those people within that period of 1948 until 2002, they lost their citizenship as a matter of law if they took up another citizenship.
That's quite a long period of time. Is it possible to gather how many people would have been affected?
No, it's not really, because there's no register or framework for determining that. But in a society like Australia, which is part of a globalised world, more and more people would have travelled. They're up to, I think, at different periods, over 1 million people who live in the Australian diaspora who may have been seen it appropriate to take up another citizenship without that necessarily diminishing their sense of connection to Australia. So people like this individual who's the subject of this story would have taken up another citizenship for a range of reasons without that in any sense feeling like a way of renouncing their Australian citizenship. And so that's why it's such a shock. And
presumably, Professor, though, they were told that their citizenship was being taken away when it was?
So no, this is the anomaly of a notion of an operation of law. So if you go to another country and you apply for their passport or another form of citizenship, that country doesn't have any obligation to tell you of your citizenship laws requirements. And as a matter of practice, Australian citizenship can be publicised, and there would have been some discussion in the media around that time because it was the process of the move to changing that law because of the unfairness and the policy being seen as not appropriate. But there wasn't a formal process for individuals to be told by the Australian government in a direct sense when they were making those decisions. And so in that sense, there is, by the practice of automation by law, something less transparent for Australian citizens. There isn't a formal process involved.
So is this repeal of it retroactive? I mean, is it being remedied for the people that lost their citizenship? Can it be backdated to when they lost it from? Because they were still Australian citizens.
So the legislation, when it changed, did provide for those people who lost their citizenship to resume their Australian citizenship. So to make an application to become an Australian citizen again. But it didn't necessarily make them Australian citizens for all that time. They just restarted their Australian citizenship. And the problem there is for those individuals who during that period had children who they would have automatically been able to pass on, well, not automatically, but would have had the right to pass on their Australian citizenship to their children born outside of Australia if they were Australian citizens at that time. But if they weren't an Australian citizen at that time, then their children didn't have the capacity to apply for citizenship by descent. So that is one of the practical consequences. Even though those individuals can resume for themselves their Australian citizenship, it doesn't help them enable their children through that process to become citizens.
It all sounds like a bit of a mess. Is there any political appetite for remedying any of this?
Look, I think there are a range of frameworks where Australian citizens aren't really aware of the permutations and combinations of citizenship law. We saw that obviously in another context with Section 44 of the Constitution. This is slightly different though, because the aim for the legislation was to make it possible for people to become citizens without dual citizens, without that in any way diminishing their Australian citizenship in terms of the consequences of citizenship. But I don't think there has been as much awareness of the consequences for the next generation and for the very dramatic, I guess, jolts to one's identity as an Australian citizen, to think that you've been living your life as an Australian citizen, but actually as a matter of law, you were not an Australian citizen. You might have been voting, you might have been travelling on your passport, because there aren't formal consequences that would have led to the rescinding of that passport. It would have only been when one went to apply for a new passport, where there may have been a question about whether you held another citizenship. And then just holding the other citizenship doesn't mean you're not an Australian citizen. There would have had to have been an inquiry as to at what point you became another citizen, so forth. So it's actually very complicated.
It certainly is. It's an amazing story. Professor Kim Rubenstein, thank you for explaining it to us.
My pleasure.